the statement in the Gospel according to Mark and elsewhere, where Jesus seems to predict his demise in this way, has been taken by many scholars to be unhistorical. And this has been specifically noted in a book by Kurt Allen, a book entitled The Gospels Rediscovered. Now, in analyzing these statements, many scholars think that Jesus could not have uttered these statements. They are in fact uttered, they are now written in the Gospels as predictions after the fact. In other words, the Gospel writers here are working with the idea that Jesus could not have died in this way that seems to mark him out as a failure. If he died in this way, he must have known about it, he must have even predicted it and expected it, and everything has obviously happened according to plan. There is some plan here that we haven't quite figured out, but certainly this happened according to the plan of God. That has been known to Jesus. Jesus certainly declared it to his followers, and so there's nothing left to explain. Now, why have they reached this conclusion? Well, one reason is that the Gospel according to John has a statement that would read against the grain of these predictions. In other words, we have the predictions. The predictions have it that Jesus is saying to his disciples, even before he was arrested. He says it not once, but 3 times, on separate occasions. I'm going to be arrested, I'm going to be crucified, I will be killed, and eventually, after 3 days, I will rise again. Then this was a known prediction to all of his disciples, something that they could hardly forget, especially since the events begin to unfold exactly as predicted. Jesus is arrested. He is whipped. Not as much as depicted in the Passion of the Christ. This is overblown. But more so, perhaps, as depicted in another film by John Heyman, Jesus of Nazareth. There Jesus is whipped, and he obviously has suffered from that, but he's still up and running. So, he is arrested, he is whipped, he is eventually hung on a cross, and then he dies. Everything exactly is already given in these predictions. Now, one thing remains for him to resurrect from the dead. And that obviously should be expected. But John's Gospel has a very interesting statement. It tells us in John chapter 20 that when Mary Magdalene went to report to the disciples that Jesus' tomb is empty, Peter and John, or Peter and the beloved disciple, because he's not named here, Peter and the beloved disciple rushed to the tomb, and they see it exactly as the women had described. And they went away pondering what this could all mean, because they did not yet know the scripture that Jesus was to rise from the dead. Some translations have it, they did not yet understand the scripture that Jesus was to rise from the dead. And this other translation blunts the edge of the problem here. Because it might say that, well, the scripture was known, but not quite understood. But even so, what was there to understand? If Jesus so explicitly declared, as you have read out, that he's going to be arrested, and he's going to be whipped, and crucified, and he will die, and then he will rise again the 3rd day, what was left to be understood? And moreover, what scripture was being referred to? Jesus' sayings were not yet scripture. The scriptures would be written later. But the scripture that was referred to was obviously the Old Testament scripture. So what John is saying here is that these disciples did not yet know or understand the Old Testament as a book of predictions about Jesus. A book which actually tells you, if you read it properly, that Jesus will rise from the dead. But of course, if Jesus had already said this to them on 3 separate occasions, quite explicitly that he will rise from the dead, there was nothing left for them to understand. And so we have here a good indication that Jesus did not actually say this. Now, that was my first part of the answer. The second part is to say that even if John did not have this statement, the flow of events do not corroborate the idea that Jesus had already declared this on 3 separate occasions. Because if he had declared this, you would expect that the disciples would live with the expectation that Jesus should rise. Perhaps they would be in close proximity to the tomb, waiting for something to happen, waiting perhaps to be the first ones to embrace Jesus when he comes back out of the tomb. But there obviously was no such expectation. The gospel reports that describe the reappearance of Jesus show invariably that the disciples were taken by surprise over this. They had no clue what to expect. At first they think that they could not recognize Jesus. They think they are seeing a ghost. They cannot believe the reports which are brought to them by the women. They think the women are speaking nonsense, and so on. So obviously all of these show that the disciples did not have an expectation that Jesus would rise from the dead, and that seems to indicate that Jesus had not said this to them in the first place. For if he did, they would have had an expectation of it.